Alrighty, so let's just crack in. Rob Bell is with me today. How are you doing today, Rob?
I'm doing great. How about you?
Fantastic. I'm amazing. I'm very excited, and yeah, this has been a long time coming. To be honest, you've been on my hit list for about 7 months now.
You have a hit list.
I
Wait,
do. I'll
is
tell you,
this the right?
Pete Holmes is next, by the way.
Okay, I will warn him that there's a hit out on him.
He knows. He knows. Actually, Dave, our mutual friend David Vanderveen actually connected us on Twitter, so it's amazing.
Yes, I love
Yes.
David Vanderveen.
He is amazing. Yes. Actually, him and I are going to record tomorrow. So,
Oh, good.
yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. So, yeah, where do we begin? I guess what I want to do, Rob, is I'd like to sort of give a kind of what I like to do with some of my guests is sort of to give a brief kind of thumbnail sketch of how I came across your work and things like that. So, basically, I'm one of these typical grew up in the church all of my life kind of kids, you know. It's just this Christian bubble. I went to a Christian school and only listened to Christian music, etc., etc. I'm sure you've heard this like a million times. But I essentially I was a very black and white sort of a person. So I saw the world very binary, like heaven, hell kind of narrative, and long story short, after high school, ended up getting involved with street evangelism. So I was one of those kind of Christians. And, yeah, really actually believed the whole deal. Like the whole heaven, hell, like this is the story and we have to go tell people. And if we don't, then we're bad Christians, sort of a thing. And, you must be familiar with this story.
I have heard that. I've heard what you're talking about. Yep. Then what happened?
So,
Then what happened?
Yeah, what happened next? So essentially, I was involved with this sort of movement for around 5 years, and I actually did it full time for at least a year with support from people and things, and yeah, it was amazing. Learned so much. What I like to say is, in the sort of tail end of doing this, I actually stopped and started listening to people instead of just going, here's a message, if you don't listen to me, you might be in trouble with God, you know? So that was a really profound experience because I actually started to humanize these people instead of just seeing them as numbers. So the very first exposure I had to your work, essentially, was the NOOMA entitled Bullhorn, ironically. Which I'm sure you're familiar with that because you were in it. So that was the first encounter I had with what you were doing. And obviously it was in a time where I was doing exactly what you were kind of saying not to do. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
So what do you do? What brings you joy now? What gets you up in the morning now? What are you doing now?
Oh my goodness. I say this to people all the time. I'm ridiculously optimistic and I quite honestly sometimes don't even know why. I don't. I just, I love, and this is like, I know you're a big fan of, I'm going to use your own kind of rhetoric against you, to be honest. Because I know you like to park us in the tension of things, you know? So I'd love to do that if we can. And I reflected this to David Vanderveen. It was amazing to connect with him because I sort of tested the waters a little bit, you know. But I am stuck, and I said to him, quite frankly, I'm terrified sometimes. I'm exhilarated, and I have this optimism, like I say, but I'm quite scared because I've sort of been kind of bumbling through life up until this point, and many failures. Well, I just want to say, on the subject of failure, that was your Drops Like Stars tour was the art of failure was the biggest part of that resonated with me. You know, like you sort of had that line when you said, you know, every good artist must realize that even the failed pieces are necessary, right?
Absolutely.
It's
Absolutely.
so incredibly true. And it's beautiful, and it's the suckiest way to learn anything, but you never forget these things. And so that was that. And then, where was I? Oh, yeah. So I'm trying to park us in the tension of something, aren't I?
Okay.
Yeah. So I was saying this to David. I said, on the one hand, I listened to the likes of you talking to Pete Holmes or Elizabeth Gilbert, and I go, oh man, and you talk to Jay Moore, who is going to talk to me at some point because I emailed him religiously until he responded. But this sort of, I hear this, on your latest podcast, literally with Jay Moore, you talked about this like no fear idea, right? Like just no fear. And I'm going, oh man, that sounds amazing. Let's sign up for that. And then I go, but wait a minute, we live in a world where you've got things like Cologne, Germany, right? Where you've got these like crazy things happening. And some people just don't seem to want to talk about these things. And, just recently, a girl who was, essentially assaulted in this mass thing that happened came out recently on Facebook and apologized because she felt that talking about her story would incite racism, right? And I'm going, what? So this is the tension, right? I'm going, on the one hand, I look at what you're doing and what you're saying, and I'm going, absolutely, like, sign me up for that. But then I go, what do you do with all this other stuff? Where do we even start with this, Rob?
I don't see it as a tension. The world is in trouble. The world's on fire. There is violence and degradation and hunger and starvation. And some people, or all people, is probably more accurate, we each have a role to play in the repair and the restoration and the reconciliation and the renewal of all things. So that's why I asked you, what gets you up in the morning? What we each have this penetrating question right before us, which is, how are we going to use these sacred God-giving energies we have to help bring reconciliation and renewal and restoration to the world?
Yeah. So
it's easy to go on YouTube and make mean comments, but it's actually a really, really tragic thing when people use these incredible energy, time, talent, resource, passion to just essentially squander it on shredding other people. Yeah. We have big problems in the world, from people who are in situations where they don't have education, they don't have job opportunities, they don't have food, water, shelter, and they're vulnerable to radicalization, all the way to people who just need to learn how to read, to, 1 million people committed suicide last year.
Oh, man, that's on my heart at the moment, quite frankly.
Right, so...
I just did sorry, just to jump in, on the male suicide thing, I literally watched a video on YouTube last night, and I made a little 5-minute podcast about it. It was essentially these two guys that basically staged it. They got into a cab, essentially, and... started talking to the cab driver and saying, oh, like, my girlfriend just left me and my job's, I lost my job. And essentially they pulled up next to a bridge, and, like, basically, long story short, was they, indicated to the driver, hey, I'm going to jump off this bridge, right? And it was amazing to watch. And, they basically, these guys got out of the cab and they were just, like, pleading with them. And it was this, like, human moment, right? They were just like, no, you matter. Your life is important. Like, don't do this, And it was just, and I reflected, I had a guy I went to high school with that, a couple of years ago actually committed suicide. And I was talking about this with my twin brother, James, and, I was just saying, we were talking about his life, and it was just like, he had this, like, really hard life where he didn't grow up with his parents, and, nothing just seemed to go right for him. And, you just sort of, these people that get lost by the wayside. And I know this is, where you are hugely empathetic, and where do we begin? And like you said, I'm totally with you on the comments thing, because it's so easy just to rail against things.
Yes, that's the great question. It's the great question for every one of us is, who are we and what are we doing here, and how are we going to give ourselves to the repair, the renewal, the restoration of the world?
The tikkun olam.
Yes, exactly. So that's to me, it's the pressing question of our day. Yeah. And it's very easy to use your energies on all sorts of things that don't help make a better kind of world.
Absolutely.
So that's why when you talk about all of the empowered, fearless, let's go do it, and you talk about all of the things that are wrong, the one is the answer to the other. I also think in talking about no fear, it's important to leave room for fear. Fear, you think about early brain development, if there's think about our ancestors. If there's a lion in the bushes, you need to know because you need to run so that lion doesn't eat you. So you have an early, back of your brainstem that had this very primal fight or flight impulse. So fear kept you alive. Fear is good.
I literally just talked about that very idea with this girl, Sophie. She's from the UK. So funny. I have to mention her. She describes herself as an atheist, but she says, my friend said to me the other day, she goes, Sophie, you're barely an atheist, and she goes, I'm very disillusioned with that movement, and we went on to talk about that, but, she was exactly saying that whole kind of impulse that you were saying, that the kind of, fear, fight or flight sort of a thing, so,
yes.
So, yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
What do you want to talk about next?
Well, I thought maybe if we can, not for my sake, because I'm well aware of who you are and what you do, and how awesome you are. But can we just maybe rewind? Because I'm imagining that people are going to listen to this. A number of my audience are sort of people on the edges, like atheists even, people that, have kind of burned out and given up on faith completely. So maybe if we could rewind a little bit, and if you could give us sort of a thumbnail sketch of to someone who doesn't know Rob Bell, who is Rob Bell and why should we care? Can we sort of do that? Is that okay?
Sure. Start in. Where do you want to start?
Oh dear. Well, you obviously started out in Grand Rapids, correct? With your church.
I grew up in Michigan, and then I lived in California, and then I lived in Michigan, and now I live in California. Twice I've lived in Michigan. Twice I've lived in California.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. So, yeah, the origin story, and again, time is limited, but, obviously it's fascinating to hear about Mars Hill and where that began. Can we talk a little bit about that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I grew up in Michigan. I went to college. I was in a band in college, and we thought we were going to be the next great saviors of rock and roll, or at least I did. I don't speak for others. And then the band broke up senior year of college, like college bands do, because people need to get jobs. And around that time, I preached my first sermon, and I was absolutely captivated by this art form. I understood it to be an art form, and it felt to me like the sermon had been hijacked and by a number of things, politics and money and dogma and doctrine that were lifeless.
I'm familiar with these things.
The sermon needed to be reclaimed as this beautiful, provocative, mysterious, inspiring art form that it is. Now, my parents had taken us to church growing up a fair bit, and I was always struck with how a church service talking about grace, love, compassion, hope, peace, should be riveting. I mean, these are the big ideas that human beings have wrestled with for thousands of years. A church service should be incredibly inspiring, but how come it was so boring? I couldn't make sense of that. And I found the stories of Jesus, his inclusion, his compassion, how when he was asked a question, he would respond with a question, which I loved. I loved how whatever system had pushed somebody to the edges, he always would move to the edges. And for those who nobody would hear their cry, he would hear their cry.
Yeah.
And so I found Jesus utterly compelling, and he didn't seem to have any interest in starting a new religion. He seemed to be about the very depths of humanity. What does it mean to be human? And he seemed to have great capacity for doubt and anger, and this was not a polished sort of airbrushed caricature of what it means to be human. There was something real and something about him, I believe. Something spoke to me about the depths of what it means to be human and what it means to be alive. Yeah. But I always found it odd that I didn't feel like the whole movement that sort of called themselves his people didn't seem to be reflective of that.
We had some PR issues.
And so I think probably, it's almost like you later in life realize the seeds of who you've become were way back there. When I set out to reclaim the sermon, there was something in there about at least giving the Jesus story a fair hearing. And I went to work in a church. I went and studied. I studied psychology, and then I studied theology in graduate school, and then I got a job in a church. And I was doing things like I was doing funerals for people who had died of HIV/AIDS. And I was probably 24, 25. And I sort of just was thrown in the deep end of the pool. And I saw lots and lots of suffering, and I saw we were running recovery programs and working with homeless and everything under the sun. And I kept discovering how desperate we are for help navigating the larger questions of life, whether it's loss or betrayal or heartache or death. And so then I just kept, my wife Kristen and I became overwhelmed with the sense that the church that I first worked in, this church, the language that is spoken here isn't the language that my friends speak. And I thought, well, let's start something new and see what happens. So we started a church from scratch, and it was almost like a giant art experiment sometimes, and it felt like, and it resonated. We wrote a lot of our own music, and we rented this warehouse for $1 a year, and
It's awesome.
it was just sort of, we gave away most of the money from the offerings. I remember at one point the roof was leaking, but we had heard about a church in South America that had a leaky roof. And so we thought, wouldn't it be cool if instead of fixing our roof,
solidarity,
we gave money to another church that had a leaky roof.
I
So
love it.
I just felt like a lot of things needed to be taken apart so that we could build something that might speak to those who needed to hear what we had, what we were doing. And so I did that for 12 years, and it was an extraordinary, it was just an amazing chapter of my life. And then it was time, it was done. And it was not done because anything was wrong. It was done because, if the sitcom is funny for 5 seasons, then they make 7 seasons. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It'll stay
for
too
sure.
long. It just sensed like I needed to go to try the next things.
Yeah.
And so we moved out here to Los Angeles, and I went on tour with Oprah, and I made some
I've
TV
heard
shows
of her.
with Oprah, and I have a 2-man show with the comedian Pete Holmes, and I do these events for artists and activists and entrepreneurs, just helping people think about what it means to have a spiritual life, what it means for your work to be a holy, sacred gift you give the world. And I write books, and I give sermons in strange places, and that's what and I go surfing. And I have 3 kids. My 15-year-old son plays in a punk band, and they just played in our back house. They did a show this weekend at our house with 3 bands, and it was bedlam. I loved it. And I have a 6-year-old daughter and a 17-year-old son. And so for me, life is lived here with my kids and my wife and some friends in the middle of Los Angeles. That's the center of everything. And then going out and speaking or whatever, doing a podcast like this is great fun, but I'm not confused. Like, real life is being a good dad and being a good friend and finding the divine in the everyday. So that's a really long answer to a good question.
That's amazing. It's such a great grounding to build from, honestly. Just to speak to the point, I mean, I was following along, obviously, down here in New Zealand with the podcast. It was amazing that you guys made that available. And I listened to the last service you spoke at when obviously you transitioned to LA and everything. And honestly, you hear all these stories of, that so-and-so's left this church and blah, blah. But honestly, the feeling that I kind of got listening to that service was like, they are like gift wrapping you to the world right now, you know? Like, it was kind of like this launching into
that's nice of you to say.
It's like they were launching you into the stratosphere. It was amazing. It was amazing. And I picked up on the podcast, and I'd love to dive into this for a little bit, with the, you know, the whole Sermon on the Mount series. I could talk to you for a week, Rob, about the first message you gave. Like, honestly.
Yeah, poor in spirit.
Oh, my
Zeros.
Goodness. The spiritual... Oh, I know. Can we talk about that? Oh,
yeah.
Man alive. That,
game changer, isn't it?
Oh, my goodness. You know, you talked about these profound ideas about, you know, the losers, the down and outs, the no ones. Yeah, as you say, the spiritual zeros. And I'm going, yep, that's me. Thank you so much. This is genuinely good news, you know? It's incredible.
Yeah.
And you even, I don't know if it was in that series, but you even, you know, you kind of got really specific, and you were like, to all those over here who've had a divorce, or over here if you've had an abortion, and you're going, God is on your side, you know? And I'm going, oh my goodness. And I love this. And I love your passion. I love the relentless affection that you have for Jesus, quite honestly, because I know that it annoys a certain group of people in the evangelical community, but I love it because you recapture this thing, and you reframe it in this beautiful way, and it's amazing. And I know your very first chat with Jay Moore, he actually quoted the title of that book, which I'm yet to read, was Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalists, right? It's you know, I think it's John. Is it John Shelby Spong? I think.
Oh yeah,
yeah. And I mean, I got blessed just by hearing the title of that book. Quite honestly, I was like, I love that idea. I love the fact that you just do what you do, and the language and the articulation that you have around these things. And I sort of wonder, on a pragmatic sort of level, when all this kind of started emerging and erupting, what was the feedback? What was the real life flesh and blood kind of stories that emerged from Mars Hill?
Oh, like actual stories?
Well, yeah, like, I mean, I'm curious, because just to say one more thing, sorry, but, you know, as a listener, and I actually said this to, I talked to Shane Hipps, who I know you know, you know, about this idea of being this outside listener. I had this kind of feeling that, oh man, Mars Hill just sounds like the most amazing, you know, I was like, this is better than Disneyland, you know, like, what is going on here? And it was quite clear to me that something was happening, and I'm just curious, like, you know, yeah, like actual stories for sure. Like, what sort of things did you encounter when you started doing what
I think you would, if you had been a part of that community when I was there, I think you would have been overwhelmed with the normalness of it.
I did.
I don't think you would have been like, oh, look, a rocket scientist. Oh, look, a neurosurgeon. Oh, look. I think you would have said, oh, these are very normal people who are trying to be a particular kind of presence in the world. Yeah. So nobody was under any illusions that somehow they had cracked the code on some new way of being human. Yeah. I do think, though, you would have found... excuse me. I do think you would have found a deep desire to be a part of making a new kind of world. And I remember there was like one family that had been, they had been helping out in an inner city school, and there was a kid, I think the dad had been tutoring this boy, and this family lived out in the suburbs, and they had been going downtown and helping out at the school, and there was this young boy whose family life was a mess, and the family had gotten involved with him, and there was an opportunity for them to adopt this boy. And I remember that I think they had 2 high school girls, and the parents were trying to decide, and the high school girls said, you either adopt him or stop taking us to that church, because that church fills our heads with all kinds of ideas about what's possible and how we can help.
Love it.
I like that story because it's very normal.
Yeah.
And I would just get to meet... There was a woman who would come every week who really struggled with cutting, and she would hand me a sheet of paper each week. and it would be the number of days since she'd last cut.
Yeah.
So when I look back on that, it feels like another lifetime ago. When I look back on that, I don't think of big, giant, churchy gatherings. I think of the very real people that I knew who were struggling to do good work in the world, or even just to make it another day without cutting.
Yeah.
And I think I think people think they want answers, but I actually don't think people want answers. I think what you want is what we crave is solidarity.
Oh, yeah.
We just need somebody to walk with us. And that's the power of a community or friends, or ideally a church would be this place where you are free to be human. So even if you think about the Bible, like the Psalms, this collection of prayers in the middle of the Bible, they're absolute gut level, God, crush my enemy. I don't even want to go another day. Why do you turn your back from me? And you know what? Finish off my enemy's kids. Crush my enemy's kids, too. I mean, it's this violent, vicious, visceral, but that's how life is. You have all of these competing emotions and responses, and there is power in giving expression to your experience of the world. And the idea behind a spiritual path is that you have these ways that you can give expression to what you're experiencing so that you don't shove it down farther and cause even more heartache in the world.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Absolutely. I love this. I'd love to dive into this whole solidarity concept because it's huge, right?
Okay. Let's dive in.
Yeah. So, where I found solidarity in a huge way, obviously given my story, was obviously in Love Wins, 2011, right? You know, when I read that, I have to say that what you reflected in that book wasn't anything new to me, I have to be honest. I wasn't like, oh, this is a new idea. The feeling I had quite honestly was, oh, I'm not the only one asking these questions. You know, honestly, I was because I was that person. I was this heaven or hell narrative. I lived that. I lived and breathed that. And to go, and I started deep. It was a couple of years earlier, before that book even came out, that I was really wrestling with the questions anyway. And I was going, man, like, is this the story? Can this be right? You know, can this be okay? As somebody who literally went out and told people, you know, if you don't pray the certain prayer or do these certain things, you're in big, big trouble forever. To read Love Wins and go, wow, there's some space here. So can we talk about that for a little bit? And I don't really want to go into the whole, oh, it's such a controversial book, blah, blah, blah. That's all been done, right? Like, I wouldn't...
It's not a controversial
it's
book.
Not.
There's nothing in that book that's new.
I know.
Very straightforward.
I love that you said that. I love it.
Very straightforward. It's been said 1,000
let's
times.
say there were certain groups of people you may or may not have heard of that thought it was controversial, Rob. So, yeah. So
how many people are at odds with their own tradition.
Yeah.
It's interesting. People can become cut off from the depth and breadth of their own tradition, their own tribe. So, for example, I was just talking with this fantastic Scottish teacher named John Philip Newell the other day, and he was talking about how 2nd century Celtic spirituality had as one of its central tenets care for the earth. So 1,800 years ago, there was a faith tradition that put massive importance on how we care for the environment. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They also, 2nd century Celtic spirituality placed a great emphasis on the sacred feminine, that the divine is reflected in both masculinity and femininity. So when you think about honoring women and women being paid the same as men for the same task, when you think about caring for the earth, these are all what are considered very, very progressive issues that 1,800 years ago, firmly within the Christian tradition, there were communities deeply devoted to these very issues. So
yeah, it's funny. I mean, look, I don't want to get into anything too controversial, but you did bring up things like
why?
Well,
Why
let's. I mean, let's go. Okay, well, let's do it. Obviously, I mean, you mentioned obviously things like women and men being paid the same. This is something very much on my radar at the moment, and I'm sort of connected with this sort of ideology that's kind of basically pushing back on that. In the West at least, there seems to be a gap between the understanding of wages and earnings, and it's illegal essentially in the West to pay a woman less than a man, so that's not a reality, is it?
Well, I think that what a number of people are noticing is that it is not fair, and the system is not open and straightforward about its acceptance and its compensation of women.
Yeah.
And this is just something that in the evolution of the universe is our next step, is we have to move to greater equality.
I think, yeah. And I know there's literally a conversation going on with Vanity Fair right now on Twitter about this whole subject, by the way. It's interesting. And I think, I connected with a guy, Milo Yiannopoulos. He's a journalist from the UK last year, and he's, opening up this whole free speech debate on college campuses and things like that. And just, it's incredible what's happening. And there's a lot of pushback and things. But one of the things he says is you can't solve a problem when you lie about it in your first sentence, right? Like,
That's great.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah, you just can't. And I mean, he is amazing. He's one of these, like, provocateur. You two would be the meeting of minds, quite honestly. He is very, when you get, on the subject of things like male suicide, right? You get him talking about that, and he'll bring you to tears. It's amazing. He's like, this issue of male suicide is something that virtually nobody wants to talk about. And it's incredible, So there is some space for conversation here. And it's funny, the whole, I don't want to be controversial thing. I actually said this to David Vanderveen, and I was like, I had this kind of hesitation. I was like, I don't want to be controversial. I was like, is there anything Rob doesn't want to talk about, blah, blah. And I was like, you wrote Love Wins, for goodness sake. I don't think you were afraid of a conversation.
Funny. So what else to talk about?
Well, okay, so obviously I've sort of followed the trajectory of your writing since, day one, really, like Velvet Elvis and, everything like that. I mean, well, here's a good space to go into. Mental health is a huge topic for me. 2008, I was diagnosed as bipolar. So I had what was called a hypermanic episode, which sounds much more fun than it really is. Yeah, so I had this sort of experience, and that was kind of the undoing of a lot of the ground of my being, and my beliefs were very shaken up. And a good friend, Maddie Martin, he gave me, a couple of your books, and I was like, oh man, there's some space here. And that's what you did for me, is that you gave space to go, because you handed this sort of narrative of like, it's in or out. Like, you either believe it all or believe it none. And you kind of go, no, there's some questions here and there's some space. So I guess, yeah, I mean, what sort of feedback do you get from people in that kind of arena? People like myself who have grown up in the church all their life, sort of a thing. Like, what's the sort of feedback that you often get in that regard?
Well, yeah. Well, first off, thank you for sharing that about your story. That sounds like you have been down quite a road, and that helps me understand your heart and empathy and appreciation for solidarity. Is that suffering, it either closes us down or it opens us up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
It makes us bitter or better. And what I have seen again and again and again, which you were sort of witnessing to, is so many people were handed a template for their life. This is how your life is supposed to go. This is what's acceptable. This is not. This is what you can talk about. This is what you can't. And have all sorts of assumptions and expectations that cause them no end of pain and suffering. And sometimes what we simply need is to be told, wow, that thing you went through was brutal. You must be exhausted. And being anger is a very normal response to that. Loneliness is a very normal response to that. Disorientation is a very normal response to that. And what so often happens is we beat ourselves up over, I don't know why I'm feeling this way. I'm sure no one else would be feeling this way. Why am I not stronger? Why am I not more confident? Why am I not smarter? Why am I not able to handle this with more grace and ease? And that will get you nowhere. And sometimes we just need somebody to say, your life hasn't gone how you thought we're told it would go, and you're going to be fine. And your response to that is a very normal human response. So to me, the power is that Jesus comes in his full humanity to lead us into our full humanity. And the full humanity includes doubt and struggle and agony and loneliness and joy and euphoria and community and solidarity and music and good food and conversations like this. And that it's good to be human. And for so many people, somewhere along the way, they were told it's not good to be human. You need to be something else. You need to be perfect. You need to simply say this so that you can go somewhere when you die and then you can really live, instead of simply acknowledging you're a human being. It's sometimes really difficult to be a human being, and that's okay. Your response to it's okay.
Yeah, for sure.
It's okay. It's very
for sure, absolutely. And it's this sort of thing where you go from, as I say, I went from this person that essentially, at least believed that I had all the answers, whether I did or didn't, that's a different question, but clearly I didn't. But to feeling like you had everything all together. I didn't really experience a lot of doubt growing up. I was in this sort of bubble and everything like that. And it all crumbles to the ground, and you can't. What I've often reflected to people is you can't rebuild the same structure with the crumbled pieces, right? You just can't.
Correct.
You got to find some new material.
Yeah, and you've had to take the whole thing apart, and deconstruction is very necessary. Oh yeah, we were talking. So it's important to affirm that sometimes you take everything apart, to question it all and tear it down to its foundations. But then you have to build something new. And sometimes what happens is people are still tearing the thing apart, still bitter, still haven't forgiven anybody, still blaming somebody, still upset that they were raised in whatever that kind of home or given that worldview. But at some point, you have to take it all apart, but then you have to keep going and build the new thing. And you have to figure out who you are and why you're here. And deconstruction is absolutely necessary, and it can be incredibly galvanizing. It can bond you with others, especially if they're taking apart something similar. But then we have to keep going. And there's this great rabbinic phrase, any old donkey can tear down a barn, but it takes a special one to build one.
I love that. I've heard you say that before. I love it. I was waiting. I knew that line was coming, by the way. I was like, oh, yes. No, it's awesome. I got that soundbite. No, I love it. No, look, I love it. I think it's fantastic. But it's interesting, and the whole thing is really fascinating. What's happening, and to keep things interesting, I mean, I recently interviewed a transgender woman on my podcast, which was amazing as an experience. It was incredible. And it's one of these things, and going back to this guy Milo who I mentioned, he's sort of creating the space for conversation. And what's inevitably happening is a number of people in these communities, the gay community, the trans community, everything like that, there's a number of them actually sort of coming out and distancing themselves from a lot of the left ideology, essentially, and saying, this mainstream media sort of doesn't represent me, doesn't speak for me, and things like that. And that's interesting to me. That is interesting space for conversation. And I know, like, you've written about these things and talked about it. I wonder what your experience. How do you feel? I mean, I'm keen to. I guess I should throw a question here. There seems to be this ideology that typically comes from the left that sort of says if you don't agree with, things like gay marriage, etc., you're automatically a bigot. And I just don't buy that narrative. I just don't think that's, even Milo, who is himself a gay Catholic conservative, isn't the biggest proponent of gay marriage, ironically. So there's obviously some nuance here.
Well, instantly labeling people who don't agree with you a bigot, obviously, as you said, is a little dangerous.
Just a little bit.
What exactly is your question? Your question is about...
I guess it's more of an observation. I don't know how to turn it into a question.
Bigotry?
Well, it's just this kind of... It seems to be what happens even in, the political sphere is this kind of orthodoxy that goes on that if you don't toe the line, then you're out. And it seems to be a bit problematic. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that in general.
Yeah. Well, I love the fact that Jesus called students, because if you're a student, there's a fundamental humility into being a student. Well, what's helpful for me is that Jesus called disciples, and a disciple is a student, but not a student in the sense of just cramming things into the brain, but a student more like a martial arts disciple, like you're learning how to actually do it. And so the power to me is there's a fundamental humility built into being a student, that you're learning a path and so you both embrace certainty, but you also give a little space when somebody is so too certain, because certainty can also be really destructive when it doesn't have humility and mystery accompanying it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
So anytime an ideology gets ahead of steam and starts announcing we're right and everybody else is wrong, and it gets that sort of, I think you're speaking to that knee-jerk thing that happens when it's anybody who doesn't agree with us, we use the most loaded term we can think of.
Yeah, absolutely.
That doesn't actually help any sort of conversation, or that doesn't actually help us all move forward together. Now, some things I think are wrong, and some things are narrow, and some things are bigoted, and sometimes you just have to call them out.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. But just to logically push back here, I mean, I don't know if you're familiar, there was a couple of years ago, there was this, what they called this thing Gamergate. I'm not sure if you've heard of that at all. But Gamergate was essentially this sort of pushback to this gaming journalism where essentially people of all ages and races and whatnot were being told that gaming, video games essentially make you sexist, racist, misogynist, all this kind of labeling. And it was this kind of awakening that happened where, you had this generation that essentially didn't pay attention to the news, didn't pay attention to the media at all, the politics and things like that, until they started getting reported on and going, what is going on? This is horrible. Like, these people are just being completely thrown under the bus. And it was this huge awakening, and it's like there is a conversation needed to be had. And I've sort of found myself in the middle of this, and that is why, quite honestly, I'm so glad to be connecting with you, because I need a voice of reason, essentially, because I'm starting to get caught up in this a little bit and going, there's kind of this, like feminist, anti-feminist sort of conversations, and it just gets really ugly, quite honestly it does. And I'm kind of finding myself in this tension. I suppose, going back to what I said at the beginning of parking us in this tension, that's literally the tension I'm in right now. And I'm going, help, help me here. Because I don't know. I mean, this is what I said to David Vanderveen. I said, when we first connected, I said, quite frankly, I'm terrified. Because on the one hand, I do have this optimism and this joy and this kind of feeling. But on the other hand, I'm going, things aren't as they appear sometimes.
Well, it depends on what is your work in the world and what are you here to do. And what have you been through that creates within you empathy and compassion? And how can you help other people out of your own experiences, skills, talents, passions, calling? What is it that you love to do, and what is your gift? How are you going to be broken open and poured out for the healing of the world?
Yeah.
So when I find myself tied up in knots, I often it's because I'm way over in an area that's not my area. It's not my space.
It's above my pay
So
grade.
I don't actually, the example that you gave, I have no idea what you're talking about. I wouldn't have anything to say about that. What's more interesting to me is, what is it that you're here to do? And I don't take part in lots of things because there's only a few things I'm here to do.
Yeah.
And I don't know anything about those things, and I'm just going to get Apple Rainbow Death Wheel if my screen will just lock up because I just won't.
For sure. I think I appreciate that, and I appreciate absolutely, but I'm sure you can at the same time appreciate what I'm reflecting here. When we whatever it is, where people, what I'm essentially saying, whether you talk about specifics or not, what happens in these conversations is people being kind of labeled and dismissed. And you know this yourself, Rob. You know this from experience, right? Like this sort of like you just, this is what I, find interesting is that people who disagree with you just tend to ignore you and just stay in their little echo chamber. And it's frustrating to me, quite honestly, because I think there's space here for needed conversation.
Yes. Some people aren't ready for the conversation, and you cannot take people where they don't want to go.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
There are enough people who are hungry and thirsty, and you have food and water, that to try and go convince some other people that they're probably hungry just isn't on my radar. So that's where I go back to... if you're trying to get somebody to talk about something they don't want to talk about, that might be really frustrating.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And I suppose, and to go back to your work and what you're doing, I think one of the things I've admired over the years is the fact that you could have spent a lifetime engaging with critics, right? And I'd love to dive into the subject. I don't know how much time you have left, but I'd love to.
We have a few more minutes, so let's dive into it.
Yeah, let's dive into, because I did want to touch on this criticism thing, because I'm experiencing, not to the degree that you have, obviously, but yeah, how do you deal with critics? What's your kind of what's your take on criticism?
Well, first off, don't Google your name. Second, being misunderstood or criticized or hated is painful. So you're human, and it's totally normal that if large numbers of people have completely misunderstood who you are and what you're doing, that would have some element of pain to it. It's just not a part of my life. I don't hear criticism to my face. I don't go online. I don't go in chat rooms. I'm not on Facebook. I don't hear it. So I would only ever hear it in something like this where somebody would ask me about it. Yeah. Otherwise, it's not a part of my life. It's also really, really important. Going back to your question, you have to know who you are and what you're doing. And I didn't set out to prove to very religious people that I'm really religious, or to prove to somehow some Christians that I'm Christian. So that's one of the ways that people get thrown off, is they're not clear on what they're doing, and so they take criticism. They don't have a filter through which. And then I think it's really, really important that you surround yourself with people who will tell you the truth before your critics would ever tell it to you.
Yeah, I love it.
So I have friends who I have just tried to surround myself with people who would say, avoid that. That's not going to be good. That's not going to work. And And then ultimately, it's terrifying if you're stuck on the couch to have somebody get up off the couch and go do something. For many, they're criticized. The criticism has nothing to do with them. They simply went and acted and did something. They were empowered to try and make a better world. And if you are locked in the grip of fear and stuck there on the couch, unable to take risk and do something in the world, then as long as you essentially have to criticize them, so otherwise you're going to have to face the truth about your own fear. And that's terrifying, and not everybody's ready to do that.
Nope.
So when you're criticized, sometimes it is about you. Sometimes you're wrong. So you need to listen to that criticism, and you need to integrate it, and you need to make course corrections. But oftentimes, the criticism has nothing to do with you. Sometimes you simply spoke the deepest fear lurking in the system. And oftentimes what happens in systems is everybody has agreed. Everybody knows nobody believes it, but everybody's agreed not to talk about how they don't believe it.
Yeah.
And then somebody actually speaks the thing, and it's terrifying. So the key thing in all criticism is to ask, don't defend yourself. Don't get don't puff up your chest and be like, oh yeah, you want a piece of me, and start throwing punches. The most important thing to do is start asking questions. Yeah. What else is in the room? What else is in this space? Because you may try and answer the criticism, but the criticism had nothing to do with the criticism. It was about a bunch of other things.
Yeah.
And that's the key, is they may have a terror, and you are simply a face. Now their worst fear has a face.
Yeah. Yeah.
Important to know what else is in the room, because you might try and clear things up and just make an even bigger mess. And some people are deeply dissatisfied with how their life has gone, and you appear to be enjoying yourself. And
I try.
alone, that alone, might include all sorts of criticism.
Yeah.
Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah.
Let's go. You want to do one more? Let's ease some tension. Let's do one more.
Yeah. Where do we land this, Rob? Where do we land this? You're the words man. Come on, help me out.
No way. Do you had a question?
I did have actually.
You have one?
We don't want to go with this. We don't want to go. What's a burning question? What is a burning question? I mean, obviously, you've got this book, this book coming out, it's out now, isn't it? How to Be Here.
How to Be Here comes out in next week.
Yeah. So I think, okay, here's what I want to do. I haven't even read this book yet, but I kind of have a hint of what I think it's going to say to me, is this idea that, sort of contrasting it with, say, the likes of Love Wins, where you're kind of talking about the afterlife, that when I think of the title, How to Be Here, I'm thinking, I've heard you reflect these ideas of we have this moment, we have now, we can choose to be generous, we can choose to be greedy, we can choose to be kind, we can choose to be, bitter, better, all that stuff. So where do we begin if we can sort of wrap this up? How do we become more present is a great question.
Yeah, well, one of my points in Love Wins was not about the afterlife. One of the points of Love Wins was that we should begin right here and now with the conscious choices we make each day about bringing heaven to earth or creating a more hell-like earth. So that was actually one of my points in Love Wins was that when you talk about the afterlife, you're just speculating. So in some ways, this book just takes it farther. For many people in the modern world with more luxuries, opportunities, and technology than ever, it somehow has created this, I've got to get my email done. I got to answer my phone call. Ooh, I've got texts. Ooh, I've got to get to meetings. For so many people, what the modern world has done is just distract us. And in this new book, How to Be Here, I sort of take people through what I've learned. I hit my head when I was 30. I had a closed head injury. And in the concussion, I had to be introduced to my life. So I had to like ask my wife questions about where we'd met. And I got like a tour. I didn't know what I did for work, so I was told what my job was. And I was introduced to my kids.
Wow.
And I saw my life from outside of my life. And it was incredible. And because of the head injury, I was doing backflips, water skiing, and hit my head. My brain didn't have energy to think about the future, which is where worry comes from. And my brain didn't have energy to think about the past, which is where regret comes from. My brain could only be in the present moment.
Wow.
And the present moment wasn't just enough. It was too much. It was overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I was like everybody at the time, working too hard, too busy, too stressed, going from one thing to another. And I tasted what it's like to be here, fully present, and nowhere else. And it left me with this, it took about a week for the concussion symptoms to wear off, but it left me with this deep longing, like, I want to live like that all the time, but I don't even know where to begin because I wasn't taught any of this. So in some ways, the book is what I've learned over the past 15 years about being present and how to, in the course of your life, how to create a life that isn't slipping away from you, that you aren't skimming the surface of, but it's a life that's worth living, that actually has substance and shape and form to it, that you don't feel like everything's just flying by. So that's what the book's about. So, I'm very excited for you to read.
Yeah. So in closing, Rob Bell recommends Head Trauma.
Yeah, actually, in the book, at the end of the book, I talk about how, and if you could be more present without hitting your head, that would just be great, wouldn't it?
Oh, don't we have to learn everything the hard way, though? Isn't that the way it goes?
Yeah,
thank you
very well
so
said.
much, Rob. This has been...
Was this fun?
Oh, my gosh. Can we...
You're a good dude. You got a lot of life. You got a lot of life coming out of you.
Thanks.
That's pretty good.
Thanks, Rob. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Awesome.